Alan and Ryan Murphy seemed like any ordinary father and son living quietly in Liverpool, but behind closed doors they were orchestrating a £1.5 million cocaine empire that would shock the city and bring their lives crashing down. Alan Murphy was the kind of man most people in his neighborhood barely noticed. He was polite when greeted, quick to offer a helping hand if a car broke down, and always seemed busy with tools or grease-stained overalls. At 52, he carried himself with the weariness of a man who had worked hard all his life, first as a mechanic in his own garage and later as a part-time laborer when that business collapsed. To outsiders, Alan was just another working-class father doing his best to keep his family afloat in tough times. He blended in with the rhythm of Liverpool life, never drawing suspicion, never giving away the shadows that lingered in his past. Ryan, his only son, was cut from a different cloth. At 26, he was restless, full of energy, and carried the ambition of someone who wanted more than the modest life his father had endured. To friends, Ryan was sociable, quick with a joke, and always up for a night out. He picked up shifts at a warehouse, enough to cover his bills, but his eyes were always fixed on something bigger. The father and son seemed like an ordinary pair, living side by side in a modest semi-detached house, carrying the appearance of stability. Neighbors often spoke warmly of them. Alan was the type who would mow the small patch of lawn in front of his house every weekend, nodding to those who passed by. Ryan, though flashier, was still viewed as polite, often seen giving his father a hand with odd jobs or carrying groceries back home. Their relationship, though sometimes strained, appeared strong from the outside. Few realized that beneath the surface, cracks had already formed, born from Alan's disappointments and Ryan's hunger for more. Alan's fall began years earlier, when his garage, once a thriving little business, collapsed under mounting debts and competition from larger chains. The loss left him humiliated and financially ruined, unable to maintain the comfortable life he had once promised his family. Pride kept him from admitting how much it affected him, but Ryan had watched the slow decline, the bitterness in his father's eyes, and the shame that clung to him like oil on his hands. For Ryan, that failure became a reminder of what he never wanted to become, a man broken by the weight of honest work. Their house held the unspoken tension of two men shaped by different dreams. Alan longed for the security he had lost, a chance to prove he could still provide, still be respected. Ryan, on the other hand, craved fast money and the thrill of success without the years of slogging his father had endured. Together, they looked like any father and son trying to get by in a city that had seen its share of hardship. No one could have guessed that behind the curtains of their ordinary home, conversations were turning darker, opportunities were being considered, and a dangerous path was slowly taking shape. The Murphy family seemed so normal, so forgettable, that even those who lived next door would later say they never saw it coming. Yet beneath the smiles and small talk, a story was beginning, one that would transform this quiet household into the center of one of Liverpool's most shocking cocaine busts. Alan's decision to step back into the world of crime was not one he made lightly, but desperation has a way of reshaping a man's choices. After the failure of his garage, he tried everything to keep afloat: temporary jobs, borrowing from friends, cutting back on even the smallest luxuries, but nothing seemed enough. Each bill felt heavier, each demand from creditors more humiliating. What gnawed at him most was the sense that he had lost his place, not only in society but also in the eyes of his son. Ryan looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration, a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. Alan wanted to prove he was still capable of building something, of protecting his family, even if that meant turning to shadows he had once promised to leave behind. Years earlier, Alan had brushed against criminal circles while working as a mechanic. Some of his customers weren't just ordinary drivers, they were men with money who didn't ask for receipts, men who slipped extra cash his way if he looked the other way at certain modifications. Through these connections, Alan had seen glimpses of the lucrative trade in stolen cars, counterfeit parts, and occasionally drugs. Back then, he had avoided going too deep, afraid of the risks. But now, with his back against the wall, Those same connections appeared like a lifeline. He reached out cautiously, rekindling old ties with people who still remembered him as reliable, discreet, and desperate enough to follow through. Ryan's involvement came gradually, almost innocently at first. He was young, quick-thinking, and eager to help his father. At the start, Alan kept the true nature of his dealings vague, talking only about contacts and side work. But Ryan wasn't naive. He pieced together the truth, and instead of recoiling, leaned in closer. The warehouse job barely paid enough for his nights out, and the temptation of more, much more, sparked his imagination. Where Alan saw a chance to climb out of financial ruin, Ryan saw a door opening into a lifestyle he had only dreamed of. Together they formed an unlikely partnership, each bringing something the other lacked. Alan with experience and caution, Ryan with energy and ambition. The operation began with small shipments. Nothing too bold, hidden inside crates of spare car parts. They started modestly, supplying local dealers, careful not to attract too much attention. The money came quickly, and with it a dangerous sense of confidence. What struck Ryan most was how ordinary it all seemed: loading boxes, exchanging envelopes, driving across the city to industrial estates where no one asked questions. It felt less like crime and more like running a business, except the profits were faster, the risks sharper. As weeks turned into months, their network grew. Spanish suppliers saw them as dependable, willing to pay on time, and eager to expand. Liverpool, with its bustling docks and endless flow of cargo, offered the perfect cover. Cocaine shipments could be hidden in almost anything: machinery, furniture, even fruit. Alan and Ryan found their niche in automotive equipment, disguising bricks of cocaine inside heavy hydraulic pumps and engine parts. The method was clever, and for a while it worked flawlessly. By the time they had established regular shipments, the father and son had stepped into a world that was far larger than they had imagined. The money was intoxicating, but so was the power, the feeling that they were no longer trapped by ordinary struggles. For Alan, it was redemption. For Ryan, it was the start of a dream. Neither realized how carefully the authorities were beginning to watch. The deal that would define Alan and Ryan's downfall began like many others, but the scale was unlike anything they had attempted before. Their Spanish contacts had grown more trusting after months of smooth deliveries, and the Murphys were no longer seen as small players. With a reputation for reliability and discretion, they were offered a shipment that could elevate them into a higher league of trafficking. It was a staggering consignment: cocaine valued at £1.5 million, carefully concealed within industrial hydraulic pumps bound for Liverpool. For Alan it was both thrilling and terrifying. He knew the risks, understood that larger shipments brought heavier scrutiny, but the promise of profit was too great to ignore. Ryan, brimming with ambition, pushed hard for it, convinced that this was their chance to secure financial freedom once and for all. The logistics of the operation were meticulously planned. The pumps, weighing hundreds of kilograms, would be shipped from Valencia, moving through legitimate freight channels. On the outside, they looked like standard machinery ordered by a Liverpool-based company. Inside, hidden within hollowed-out steel chambers, were tightly wrapped packages of pure cocaine. Each brick was vacuum-sealed, masked with layers of grease and oil to throw off sniffer dogs and chemical detectors. It was a method tested many times before, and the Spanish suppliers assured them it had never failed. For Alan, these assurances did little to calm the anxiety gnawing at him, but Ryan was intoxicated by the boldness of it all. They had invested everything into this gamble. Cash had been pooled from earlier profits. Debts were called in, and favors exchanged. Alan saw it as a final roll of the dice, a chance to step away after one last big score. Ryan, however, spoke of expansion, of building something permanent, of using the money to establish new routes and connections. The father's cautious pragmatism clashed with the son's hunger for more, but neither backed down. Their arguments grew tense, yet in the end they both knew the shipment was coming, whether they were ready or not. When the cargo finally set sail, the Murphys waited anxiously. Days dragged into weeks, every phone call from Spain raising both hope and dread. The pumps would be delivered to a rented storage facility on the edge of the city, where Ryan planned to oversee the extraction of the hidden packages. Alan insisted on a careful approach, preferring to move the cocaine slowly into the hands of trusted middlemen. Ryan, however, was already lining up buyers, promising quantities he had not yet touched. His overconfidence unsettled Alan, but there was little he could do to rein him in. What neither of them realized was that law enforcement had already taken an interest in this very shipment. Patterns had been noticed, shipping manifests cross-referenced, and suspicions raised. While the Murphys believed they were on the verge of their biggest success, investigators were quietly closing in, watching, waiting, and preparing for the moment when the 1.5 million tamble would collapse around them. The operation to monitor the Murphys was already in motion long before the shipment arrived in Liverpool. For months, National Crime Agency had been running a broader investigation into cocaine pipelines flowing into the city, working alongside Merseyside Police. Suspicious patterns in freight documents and unusual movements of funds between Spain and the UK had set off alarms. Alan and Ryan's names surfaced not as masterminds but as small pieces of a larger puzzle. Yet as the investigation deepened, their role grew more significant, and what initially seemed like two ordinary men trying their luck soon appeared to be a central link in a dangerous network. Surveillance teams were assigned to watch them closely. Plain-clothed officers parked in unmarked cars tracked Ryan's movements from the family home to the warehouse where he worked, and later to quiet industrial estates where meetings took place in the shadows. At first, nothing seemed incriminating. Just casual exchanges with acquaintances, deliveries of packages, and routine drives around the city. But when analysts pieced the fragments together, a picture began to form. Ryan's frequent trips to certain shipping companies, the timing of his meetings, and his growing display of wealth all hinted at something much bigger. Alan, in contrast, was harder to read. He lived carefully, rarely deviating from predictable routines. He visited a few pubs, spent time in the garage tinkering with cars, and kept a low profile. Yet his phone records revealed contact with men already known to the police, figures linked to smuggling routes that stretched across Europe. Investigators were struck by the way father and son complemented one another, Alan playing the cautious strategist, Ryan the reckless frontman. Together, they created a partnership that was both efficient and dangerous. The authorities knew they couldn't act too early. A premature arrest risked losing access to the larger network. Instead, they tightened their grip slowly, tracking financial transactions, intercepting encrypted phone calls, and following shipments tied to their names. Technology played its part, with analysts monitoring digital footprints that Ryan left behind. Social media showed him posting photographs in expensive bars and wearing new designer clothes, signs of money well beyond his declared income. To investigators, it was confirmation of suspicions. To Ryan, it was nothing more than showing off. As the days passed, a decision was made to let the 1.5 million ton shipment play out. If successful, it would not only trap the Murphys, but also expose their suppliers and distributors. Every movement around the docks was watched. Cameras captured lorries arriving, containers being unloaded, and workers moving heavy machinery. Among them were the hydraulic pumps from Valencia, indistinguishable to the untrained eye. For Ryan, this was the beginning of his rise. For Alan, it was a test of nerves he could barely endure. Neither father nor son realized that their every step was being shadowed. Unmarked vans followed them through Liverpool streets, plain-clothed officers listened from the next table in coffee shops, and hidden cameras observed their storage units. The Murphys believed they had found the perfect cover. In truth, the net was tightening, and the watchful eyes of the law were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The tension between Alan and Ryan had been growing for weeks, subtle at first, but becoming impossible to ignore. At home, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the television or the scrape of Alan's tools in the garage. Alan worried constantly, pacing the floors at night, reviewing every step they had taken, fearing that even the smallest mistake could unravel everything. Ryan, by contrast, seemed increasingly untouchable in his own mind. He spent hours talking with new contacts, planning the next shipments, and imagining the life they could lead once the money started rolling in. Where Alan saw danger, Ryan saw opportunity, and that difference began to create a rift neither could ignore. Ryan's impulsiveness was the first sign of trouble. He began taking unnecessary risks, arranging meetings in public spaces, and flashing cash that should have remained hidden. Alan tried to rein him in, urging patience, reminding him that their operation depended on secrecy and caution. But Ryan was young, impatient, and enamored by the thrill of power. To him, risk was part of the excitement, proof that they were moving beyond ordinary lives and ordinary men. Each confrontation between father and son ended unresolved, leaving tension simmering beneath the surface. The strain extended beyond their relationship with each other. Friends and acquaintances noticed Ryan's sudden change. He bought expensive clothes, spent nights in flashy bars, and drove a car that far exceeded what his modest job could afford. Rumors began to circulate in their neighborhood, whispers of money that didn't come from wages. Alan felt a mixture of pride and fear, pride that his son had ambition, fear that this ambition was drawing unwanted attention. Their once tight-knit family bond began to show cracks, and Alan knew that a single misstep by Ryan could undo everything he had spent years building. Even as Alan tried to remain cautious, he couldn't escape the moral weight of their actions. Each shipment they handled, each deal they closed, reminded him of the risks not just to themselves but to their community. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. He had brought his son into a dangerous world, and the thought that Ryan could be hurt or worse kept him awake at night. He struggled to balance the desire for financial security with the growing awareness that their empire, built on secrecy and lies, could collapse at any moment. Ryan, meanwhile, pushed harder, ignoring warnings, making plans for larger shipments, and envisioning a lifestyle that seemed increasingly within reach. He boasted to friends about the scale of their operation, though careful not to reveal the full truth. Each boast, each careless action, was a risk that Alan could see, and yet he felt powerless to stop it. The father realized that controlling Ryan was impossible. The son's hunger for more had taken over, and with it, a dangerous overconfidence. The tension reached a point where silence replaced conversation. Alan watched Ryan move through the house with the confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. The garage, once a place of labor and repair, had become a planning ground for illicit activity, echoing with the unspoken fear of discovery. The father knew that their empire, built on trust, secrecy, and calculated risk, was only as strong as their ability to stay disciplined. But with Ryan increasingly reckless and the authorities already watching, discipline seemed like a fragile illusion. In the shadows of their ordinary home, the battle between caution and ambition raged on. Alan worried constantly about the consequences, about the eventual confrontation with law enforcement. Ryan, blinded by opportunity, continued to push forward, convinced that their cleverness would see them through. The cracks in their bond were growing, and each day brought them closer to a breaking point. It was only a matter of time before the tension, unchecked and inevitable, would explode, setting the stage for the events that would change their lives forever. The morning of the raid arrived like any other, cold and gray, but for Alan and Ryan, it would mark the end of everything they had built. The shipment had been successfully moved to the storage units they rented on the outskirts of Liverpool, and for a brief moment, they felt invincible. Alan meticulously oversaw the operation, ensuring the packages were stored carefully, while Ryan busied himself making calls to arrange the next move. They believed they were untouchable, that their careful planning and ordinary appearances would keep them safe. But the reality was far different. Law enforcement had been preparing for this day for weeks, monitoring their every move, and coordinating a raid that would catch them completely off guard. At dawn, unmarked vans rolled silently into position. Officers in tactical gear moved with precision, each step planned to minimize risk and maximize surprise. Inside the Murphys' neighborhood, plainclothed officers were already stationed, watching the house for any unusual activity. When the first team approached the front door, Alan was the first to notice something unusual. An unfamiliar car parked across the street, a sense of tension he couldn't ignore. Before he could react, the door was knocked down and officers flooded in, shouting instructions that left no room for denial. Ryan, caught by surprise, reacted instinctively. Panic surged through him as he realized the scale of the operation unfolding. He bolted toward the back door, desperate to escape, but officers had anticipated every move. Within seconds, he was apprehended just a few streets away, struggling to comprehend how quickly their world had collapsed. Alan, calmer but shaken, was handcuffed in his living room, surrounded by officers who began the process of securing evidence. The home, once a symbol of ordinary family life, became a crime scene, every corner examined, every drawer opened, every computer and phone seized. The search extended to the storage units where the 1.5 million pounds worth of cocaine was hidden. Investigators carefully unpacked the hydraulic pumps, discovering the meticulously concealed packages. Each brick was wrapped and labeled, exactly as Alan and Ryan had planned, but the secrecy that had once protected them now served as irrefutable evidence of their crimes. Alongside the drugs, police uncovered stacks of cash, burner phones and fake invoices, intended to cover the trail of their transactions. It was a damning collection of proof, leaving no room for doubt about the scale and intent of their operation. The news of the raid spread quickly. Neighbors who had always considered the Murphys polite and ordinary were stunned. The father and son who had once waved politely from their front garden were now the center of a citywide criminal investigation. Reporters gathered outside the neighborhood, eager to capture the story of how a seemingly normal family had orchestrated one of the most significant cocaine shipments in recent Liverpool history. The shock was compounded by the scale of the operation, 1.5 million in cocaine hidden in plain sight, and yet utterly undetectable to the casual observer. In the aftermath, the reality of their actions hit Alan hardest. The careful plans, the calculated risks, the late nights spent hiding and moving shipments, all had been undone in a single morning. Ryan, meanwhile, was left to confront his panic and regret, understanding too late the consequences of his ambition and recklessness. The bust was complete, and with it the fall of the Murphys was inevitable. Their names would forever be linked to one of Liverpool's most shocking drug operations. A story of greed, secrecy, and the high cost of choices made in desperation. The courtroom was tense from the moment Alan and Ryan Murphy were led in, handcuffed and flanked by security officers. The case had attracted attention not only for the staggering 1.5 million cocaine seizure, but also because it involved a father and son, a family whose ordinary appearance had masked such extraordinary criminal activity. Reporters, spectators, and law enforcement personnel filled the room, each aware that the proceedings would reveal details that most could hardly believe. The once quiet Murphys were now at the center of a legal storm, and the trial promised to uncover the depth of their involvement in the trafficking network. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically, starting with the shipment itself. They described how the cocaine had been concealed within hydraulic pumps and traced its origin back to Spain. Evidence collected during the raid, including cash, burner phones, invoices, and photographs, was presented in detail. Analysts explained the digital footprint Ryan had left, messages to suppliers, and evidence of meetings in industrial estates. Each exhibit painted a clear picture of a deliberate and organized operation, showing not only that Alan and Ryan were involved, but that they had played central roles in planning and executing the shipment. The dynamics between father and son became a point of intense scrutiny. Alan's demeanor in court was calm, almost detached, as if he were trying to distance himself from the chaos surrounding him. Ryan, by contrast, appeared agitated and defensive. Prosecutors highlighted the differences in their roles. Alan, the cautious strategist, had coordinated with suppliers and planned logistics, while Ryan had acted as the frontman, arranging local distribution and handling communications. The contrast between their approaches illustrated the combination of experience and youthful recklessness that had enabled the operation to reach such a scale, but also the vulnerability that would ultimately lead to their capture. Witness testimony added layers of complexity to the case. Former associates, questioned under immunity, revealed details of prior smaller shipments, confirming patterns of activity that law enforcement had already documented. Financial analysts testified to irregular transfers, showing how the proceeds of the operation had been moved through multiple accounts to disguise the source. Each piece of evidence reinforced the prosecution's argument that the Murphys had knowingly and deliberately built a cocaine network, and that their involvement was far from incidental or coerced. The defense attempted to challenge aspects of the investigation, questioning whether all surveillance and evidence collection had been legally conducted. They argued that Ryan, as a young man, had been unduly influenced by his father. Alan's defense centered on mitigating his responsibility, suggesting that his actions were motivated by desperation rather than intent to build a criminal enterprise. Yet the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution's presentation left little doubt in the minds of the jury. As the trial progressed, the story of the Murphys' double life emerged in full. Outside the courtroom, neighbors and media outlets struggled to reconcile the image of a polite, ordinary family with the reality of drug trafficking on a massive scale. The contrast between their public personas and private actions was stark, making the trial not only a legal proceeding, but also a cautionary tale of ambition, secrecy, and moral compromise. By the time closing arguments were delivered, it was clear that the verdict would hinge on the evidence of planning, communication, and execution. The Murphys had been caught not by chance, but by the careful work of investigators who had traced the network from Spain to Liverpool. Their fate rested on the balance of law and justice, and the courtroom waited in anticipation for the final judgment that would decide whether father and son would pay for their crimes. The verdict brought a profound sense of finality to the story of Alan and Ryan Murphy, marking the end of their secretive world and the beginning of a long reckoning. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the sentences. Alan, the father who had once been cautious and methodical, was handed 18 years in prison. Ryan, the younger and more impulsive son, received 12. The weight of the punishment reflected not only the scale of their crimes, but also the betrayal of trust inherent in a family-led operation. Outside, the media swarmed, capturing the shock and disbelief of a community that had once regarded the Murphys as ordinary neighbors. The fall was swift and absolute. Their home, once a place of quiet domesticity, became a symbol of criminal ambition gone wrong. Friends and neighbors who had interacted with them for years struggled to reconcile the image of polite, helpful people with the reality of drug trafficking on such a scale. The storage units that had held 1.5 million tons worth of cocaine were cleared, and investigators meticulously documented every detail. The evidence, once used to prosecute them, now stood as a cautionary tale for others who might consider similar paths. Alan and Ryan's story reverberated beyond the courtroom. It was studied by law enforcement as an example of how family relationships could facilitate organized crime, a rare case in which a father and son worked together to orchestrate a high-stakes operation. Analysts noted that the combination of Alan's experience and Ryan's youthful ambition had created both strength and vulnerability. Their success was short-lived, because it relied as much on secrecy as it did on discipline, and when discipline faltered, the consequences were swift and irreversible. In prison, Alan had time to reflect on the choices that had led him here. The gamble he had taken to regain control of his life and provide for his family had backfired spectacularly. Each day was a reminder that the very qualities that had once allowed him to navigate dangerous networks, intelligence, caution, and planning, were not enough to protect him when ambition and impatience intruded. Ryan, younger and less experienced, faced the additional challenge of understanding the consequences of impulsive decisions. Learning too late that ambition without restraint could destroy not only oneself but those closest to you. The case also sparked wider discussions about organized crime in Liverpool, the vulnerabilities of local communities, and the methods law enforcement uses to intercept drug trafficking. For the public, it became a story about the hidden dangers lurking beneath ordinary appearances. A polite neighbor, a seemingly responsible young man, both could be leading lives that no one could have imagined. The Murphys' fall served as a stark reminder that crime often hides in plain sight, and that the consequences, when discovered, are absolute. Families were warned about the seductive pull of fast money and the moral compromises it demanded. Authorities used the case as a teaching example, emphasizing that even small lapses in judgment could escalate into catastrophic consequences. The Murphys, once ordinary citizens, were now a permanent part of Liverpool's criminal history, a cautionary tale of ambition, secrecy, and the devastating costs of choices made in desperation. Their story remained a reminder that the price of crime is rarely limited to money or freedom. It can destroy bonds, reputations, and lives in a single moment. The city would not forget Alan and Ryan Murphy, the father and son whose ordinary lives hid extraordinary deception, whose ambitions ended in ruin, and whose downfall would serve as a warning for generations to come.